Um, I have a question that we can build on the current argument. I'm Chandra from Virtus Corporation. We discussed that we have this front end more globalized and close to the client, and you have the back end really working on the engineering capabilities. One of the common situations we find is that the back end cannot empathize what front end sees, or they can't feel and really understand the customer as better as what the front end does. How do you work with this type of challenge?
I think it basically builds on your first question gentleman asked. I think the companies have to have a global culture. By establishing an offshore entity here, or Indian companies going and acquiring a firm overseas, you don't become a global company. What you become is a multinational company. To become a global company, you got to set the right culture from the very beginning. It has to start at the leadership level. It needs to be assimilated within the organization to be a global company. You got to have the right DNA. What does it mean? You got to have the managements, the people who have the right exposure, global exposure. The organization structures should have a reporting of the people from here to the team at a very bottom of the pyramid. I'm not talking at the high in the organization structure. So are you able to create that type of a global team structure to effectively solve the problem? And I think the challenges companies will face is the cultural problem, and the second one is the process. So there are no processes that they have set up where part of the work, the conceptual design, program management is done locally, right to the customer, and then all the execution at the back end. They wouldn't have that process because they're not used to that type of process. In the companies in the West, there will be a lot of experienced people in the room, a lot of the young engineers come in the same room, and then they discuss across the table and then solve the problem. And it's not possible when you're working in a global environment. So you got to have a very defined process of solving a problem, conceptual all the way to the delivery. And now to ask to reinforce on that about how do you get the engineers are not connecting with the customer to understand their expectations properly. And it comes down, bottom line is that it comes down to the knowledge, the domain knowledge the engineers have to able to understand and appreciate the customer problems. And with a 2 to 3 years experience, it's very difficult for an engineer to come to understand the customer problems. Why is he asking you to solve a problem? It's very difficult to understand. So only way we can eliminate that is by creating that global structure, global environment where that knowledge sharing happens between the people sitting in the West and India happens on a running basis. And of course the tools also have to facilitate, whether you are able to share the data on a real-time basis. It cannot be done over an email expecting, he sends a request about, can you clarify this, and the next day you get a response. You cannot solve that. You cannot do that. You got to be able to work at the same time exchanging the information to solve the eventual problem.
Okay.
Yeah, is it on?
Yes, it's working. We can hear you.
Yeah, my next question is for Salim. In terms of separate engineering and design centers, which is what we tend to see in India, how much of a threat do you see current offshore manufacturing companies in the electronics industry becoming ODM companies, where they absorb the design function in there? Would they represent a real threat to the design houses here, or do you see them as coexisting and playing distinct roles?
So when you talk about design, you're talking from an end product perspective. So my perspective is from an automotive industry, because that's my background. Last 27 years I've been steeped in automotive. So if I can share the model from there, where you have seen the OEMs, especially in the US, being vertically integrated because they felt that they had to control everything, to divesting everything out. And now they're trying to find a medium in between there. And there's been a consolidation on the supplier side. I think in the electronics industry, what you're referring to, I think a similar model is evolving. And Did I answer your question, or maybe I didn't?
Well, or does it need to be a bigger manufacturing base to take over more of that responsibility, with the idea that you're developing the local market or maybe serving a broader market than just providing products to OEMs?
I think the manufacturing base is the key, because if you look at how many design centers are located in China, not for product development for global consumption, but for the local market, versus primarily the investment in India from foreign companies has been to serve a need outside India. So that's the IP model. That is the IP model, and if you're talking about how can captive design centers coexist with engineering service providers, I'll use another foundry, a silicon example. I think it's going to be driven by market forces. Right? The semiconductor companies evolved by owning their own fabs because they felt that was their core competency. They had to control their manufacturing. We controlled everything from assembly and test.